At 19, Ava Chun walked into a courtroom, accused of stealing $50 million. Framed. Forgotten. Judged by a world that never asked why. She didn't run. She didn't break. She waited for truth to catch up. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with applause. Sometimes, it's just surviving long enough to be believed again. Ava walking out of the courthouse as a crowd turned silent. She was framed for $50 until everything changed. Watch the full story. She was just 19 when her name made headlines across the country, not for a music deal, not for a scholarship, but for stealing $50 million from a fintech startup where she interned for only 3 months. They called her a genius and a criminal in the same breath. But the people who really knew her, they weren't convinced. She wasn't a thief, they said. She was a girl who loved too deeply, trusted too quickly, and got caught in something bigger than herself. Her name was Ava Lynn. Ava grew up in the quieter blocks of Atlanta, raised by a single father who worked night shifts at a delivery hub. She was brilliant, always had been, but she never bragged. She moved through school like a whisper, gentle, but hard to ignore. Her best friend, Micah, said she wasn't the type to even cheat on a test, let alone hack into a company's financial system. But love has its own logic, and sometimes, when the heart chooses first, the brain finds itself cleaning up the mess that IT started with a boy. Julian wasn't her boyfriend, not officially. But they spent every Friday night on the rooftop of an old abandoned building near their college. He was the only one she ever opened up to about her fears, about the pressure to be perfect. He called her the quiet storm. Said she had this energy that made the world feel safer. What she didn't know was that Julian was also talking to someone else, someone older, someone with power. The startup was called Velvra Systems, a rising name in digital security, sleek and young like the people it hired. Ava was one of the youngest interns they had ever brought on board, just 23, barely out of college, and already building a quiet reputation among peers as someone whose instincts you could trust. She didn't have a flashy resume. No Ivy League badge, no summer stints at high-end firms. But what she had was precision, the kind of focus that made people stop mid-conversation when she pointed something out. She got the offer after submitting a solution to one of their open-source encryption challenges. It wasn't about solving it faster. It was the way she simplified a complex vulnerability that earned her a place. They offered her a summer contract, and she said yes without thinking twice. It was more than a job. It was validation. The kind that tells you maybe you're not just lucky, maybe you belong. Ava wasn't just talented. She was disciplined. The kind of intern who arrived early and stayed late, not to impress but because the work lit something in her. Her supervisors noticed. Her coworkers respected her, even if they didn't always understand her. She kept to herself, mostly. Polite, professional, always kind, but she didn't joke around during work hours. She kept her headphones in, drank the same vanilla latte every morning, and double-checked every line of code before sending it off. That's what made it so hard to believe when the breach was discovered. It happened on a Monday. At first, no one even realized it was a breach. Just a small alert, an anomaly in the transaction log. Something that could have been dismissed as a software hiccup. But by noon, the financial department had confirmed it. Nearly $50 million rerouted to a cluster of offshore accounts. No trace of the money's original source. No ransom note. Just gone. The company froze. Meetings were cancelled. Departments were locked down. Security teams went into overdrive. They began a line-by-line review of internal systems, and within 24 hours, they had a suspect, Ava Lynn. Her credentials were the ones that showed up on the access log. Not just once, but 3 different times across 2 weeks leading up to the breach. The timestamps aligned with her badge swipes into the server room. Even worse, the access occurred during hours when she was scheduled to work alone. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was detailed, almost methodical. And that's what scared her the most. Ava didn't know how to explain it. She remembered logging in. She remembered running diagnostics, compiling updates, pushing patches, all under supervision. But when they showed her the log files, her stomach dropped. They weren't faked. At least not in any way she could disprove. Every move was clean, almost too clean, like someone had shadowed her steps to ensure it couldn't be traced to anyone else. The interrogation wasn't aggressive. They didn't handcuff her. They didn't yell. They just brought her into a room, laid out the data, and asked if she wanted to talk. She said nothing at first. She just stared at the papers, blinking like she was trying to wake up, and then she asked for a lawyer. No one in that room believed her. Not the tech lead she had worked beside for weeks. Not the HR rep who smiled at her during onboarding. Not even the junior engineer who once asked for her help fixing a line of broken code. Everyone looked at her like she had been a lie from the start. The police were called. She didn't resist. She was quiet, composed, numb. On the way out of the building, she saw her own reflection in the glass walls, hair tied back, sweater wrinkled, hands trembling, and she wondered if she had made it all up, if somehow she really had done this without realizing. But deep down, she knew. She knew she didn't steal anything. She also knew someone else did. And they were very good at hiding behind the kind of girl no one expected to ask questions. The news broke within hours. Cyber intern accused in $50 million theft. Ava's name was posted on tech forums before her father even knew she had been arrested. Within 2 days, she was trending. Not for her intelligence. Not for her work ethic. But for the digital fingerprint that pointed to her as the culprit. The world didn't wait for her side of the story. Headlines love a villain more than a victim. Especially when the villain looks so unlikely, young, soft-spoken, female, brilliant. The internet loved it. They called her the Hacker Princess, Velvra's silent thief, the digital ghost. Some even made memes. In the online world, the tragedy became entertainment. Her father found out from a neighbor. He hadn't been watching the news. He worked long shifts, slept between hours, and still thought his daughter was weeks into a promising job. When he called her phone, it rang through. When he saw her face on the television, he dropped his coffee. Ava didn't see him at her arraignment. Or the pre-trial hearing. The room was full, journalists, reporters, tech bloggers, but no one she recognized. No one who knew her. Except Micah. Micah had been her closest friend since freshman year. They didn't talk every day, but there was a quiet trust between them, like an anchor that never moved. He was there when she walked in, dressed in a gray jumpsuit, wrists bound, eyes hollow. And when she finally looked up, it was him she saw. Not the judge. Not the cameras. Him. Micah's eyes didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He didn't try to mouth encouragement or tears. He just nodded once. It was enough. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Motive, financial gain. Method, elevated system access through her intern credentials. Opportunity, time alone in the system room during off-peak hours. It didn't matter that she lived modestly. That she still took buses. That she had no luxury purchases, no debt paid off, no sign of excess. They said she was smart enough to hide the money. The defense tried to argue for her character, but it fell flat. They had no alternate suspect. No proof of sabotage. No clear motive outside of the money. And when people don't have facts, they lean on stories. The story they told was compelling. Young prodigy turns rogue, uses her gift for greed. Clean. Complete. Dangerous. Ava didn't speak during the first hearings. Her lawyer advised against it. She watched the trial like someone watching a stranger's life play out on screen. She knew every move they described. She remembered doing those tasks. But never with intent. Never with knowledge. The scary part was how easy it was for them to repurpose her work into something sinister. She started to question herself. Not her guilt. She knew she hadn't taken anything. But she began to wonder if maybe she had missed something. Maybe someone used her, and she didn't see it. Maybe she wasn't as smart as they thought. Maybe she had been blind to something, or someone. She should have known better. But she kept thinking about Julian. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. He stopped replying just before the breach was discovered. She thought he was busy. Now she wondered if he had known. If the long rooftop conversations and silent walks weren't what she thought. If she had been a chess piece from the start. She thought about texting him. About asking why. But what would he say? Sorry you took the fall? Ava didn't know if she wanted the truth. She just wanted her name back. And the truth, she feared, might not give her that either. Jail wasn't violent. Not in the way people imagined it from television. It was quieter than Ava expected. Sterile, systematic, and slow. The worst part wasn't the food or the bed or even the stairs, it was the waiting. Everything was waiting. For a hearing. For a lawyer. For a meal. For a moment where the noise of your own thoughts didn't drown out everything else. Ava shared her space with 3 other women, each with stories they wore like skin. One was in for assault, another for fraud, and the third was too quiet to speak about her charge. They were older. Hardened. But even they noticed something in Ava. Not pity. Just confusion. She didn't talk much. She followed the rules. She kept her distance. She wasn't afraid, exactly. Just worn down before she even had time to toughen up. She didn't call her father at first. She didn't want to hear disappointment in his voice, didn't want to explain the impossible. But when her lawyer, a public defender named Rachel who looked like she hadn't slept in a week, urged her to use her phone time, she dialed the number from memory. He answered. Not with anger. Not with desperation. Just a soft, Ava? She didn't speak for a few seconds. And then, all at once, she let go. She told him she didn't do it. That she didn't even know how the breach was covered up. That she was careful, so careful, but someone still outmaneuvered her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for details. He just said, I believe you. And something in her cracked open. It wasn't enough to fix things. But it reminded her who she still was beneath all the accusations. Micah came to visit her 2 weeks later. He had to get cleared. Had to answer a list of questions. Had to sit on the other side of a glass wall with a receiver in his hand. But when she saw him, it was the first time she smiled since her arrest. He brought her a book, her favorite, the one she used to reread during exam season. It wasn't allowed inside. But the gesture landed anyway. Micah told her he was digging. That he didn't trust the official story. That he knew how she worked, how she double-checked everything, how she documented every step. And if she was guilty, there would be traces, inconsistencies, a glitch somewhere. But he hadn't found one. Not yet. He also told her something strange. Julian was gone. Deleted social media. No contact with former coworkers. His apartment was emptied out less than a week after the breach. It was as if he vanished. That, more than anything, gnawed at her. Because if Julian was innocent, he would have said something. And if he was guilty, why hadn't he used her arrest to save himself? The not knowing became a prison more than the cell walls. And through all this, Ava began to write. Not emails or letters. She filled the back of her legal pad with questions, equations, time logs. She recreated every move she had made the month before the breach. Not to prove her innocence. Not yet, but to remember that she hadn't imagined her discipline, her caution, her process. In a system built to erase her, she was trying to write herself back into the record. She started small. What time did she log in? Who else had badge access? When did the company update its internal protocols? Things most people forgot. But she remembered them. Because that's who she was, the intern who didn't cut corners, who documented everything, even when no one asked. And slowly, that journal became her defense. Not in court. Not yet. But in her mind. A quiet reclaiming of her own story, one detail at a time. Clara wasn't supposed to get involved. She had left Velvra a year before the breach. Moved across the country, started a different life, different people, different pace. But when she saw Ava's name in the news, something hit her. A memory, a feeling, a wrongness she couldn't explain. She remembered Ava. Sharp. Reserved. Brilliant. Not just in the way she worked, but in the way she observed. Ava noticed things other people didn't. So when Clara saw her face plastered across the news, labeled as the architect of one of the most seamless internal thefts in tech history, it didn't sit right. She didn't tell anyone. She just booked a flight. Clara had worked with Julian too. She remembered how charming he was, well-dressed, articulate, always a few steps ahead in conversations. But she also remembered something else. The way he deferred certain questions. The way he steered Ava toward taking more responsibility than her role required. At the time, it looked like mentorship. But now, in hindsight, it felt more like a setup. She dug through old emails, found some logs from the beta testing phase of a software tool Julian had helped design. At first glance, it was harmless, just a memory-clearing protocol. But embedded in the metadata was a pattern. It created phantom activity, replicating user behaviors through timed automation. Nothing malicious. Just something that, if triggered, could mimic a user's access patterns without them knowing. She brought it to Micah. They met in a coffee shop near the courthouse, and when Clara laid it out, his face changed. "This," he said, tapping the screen, "could rewrite everything." It wasn't enough to prove Ava's innocence. But it raised the first real question the prosecution hadn't prepared for: what if Ava's access was simulated? That became their starting point. Micah and Clara didn't have legal training, but they had curiosity. They had stubbornness. And they had a growing sense that Ava had been caught in something much bigger than a stolen paycheck. They tried to contact Ava's lawyer, but Rachel was buried in 5 other cases. She didn't have time to run forensic analysis on a theory from 2 people not on the payroll. So Micah and Clara took a different route. They went to a tech podcast, not for clout. For eyes. For pressure. For people smarter than them to start asking questions. The episode aired quietly. A 20-minute segment called "The Intern Who Might Be Innocent." No dramatic music. No conspiracies. Just a breakdown of what they found, and what it might mean. Within a week, it had been shared across tech circles, then news sites, then message boards. Suddenly, Ava wasn't just a name. She was a question mark, and in the court of public opinion, sometimes a question mark is more powerful than a period. By the time Ava's third hearing came around, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. Subtly, but enough to feel it in the air. Reporters no longer scribbled her name beside words like mastermind or criminal genius. Now they lingered on phrases like possible frame-up or emerging questions. Still, none of it mattered in the eyes of the judge. Hearsay, speculation, online theories, they had no weight. What mattered were the facts submitted into evidence. And those still pointed to her. Rachel, her public defender, wasn't optimistic. "This new narrative helps outside," she told Ava. "But in here, it won't carry weight unless we can present hard data or discredit the chain of digital evidence." Ava listened quietly. She had learned not to get her hopes up. Still, the silence in her heart that once felt like despair now resembled something else: endurance. Outside, Micah and Clara worked tirelessly. Clara had traced an old subcontractor Julian once hired during his time at Velvra. A back-end specialist who had been paid a lump sum months before the breach. A man who, curiously, disappeared from LinkedIn not long after. Micah tracked a connection through a Bitcoin transaction, barely noticeable, hidden through layers of anonymizing tools. It wasn't enough to name Julian outright. But it showed he had access to tools Ava never used. It showed capability. And maybe intent. But inside those courtroom walls, Ava still stood alone. The prosecutor was sharp. Calm. Confident. He leaned into the financial records, the IP logs, the security footage showing Ava working late, always the last to leave. "Who else?" he asked the jury. Had both access and opportunity? Who else transferred the funds under credentials no one else possessed? Ava didn't flinch. But she knew. The truth, no matter how deeply she believed it, still had to be proven. Then something small happened. Rachel submitted Ava's handwritten logs. Pages and pages of her routine, her timestamps, the network irregularities she had noticed but never reported, the ones she assumed were harmless system bugs. The judge hesitated. The logs weren't formal evidence. But Rachel argued they painted a picture of Ava's character. That in a case where motive was still vague and access alone wasn't enough, the jury deserved to see who Ava was beyond the charge. The judge allowed them in. Limited scope. But it mattered, and when Ava took the stand, her voice didn't shake. She spoke plainly. Not in self-defense, but in remembrance. She walked them through her days. Her routines. Her caution. "I didn't take the money," she said, "because I had nothing to run from, and nothing to gain that was worth destroying who I am." She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She just spoke like someone who still believed in herself, even if no one else fully did. Outside, Clara got a message from a whistleblower, anonymous, claiming to have worked with Julian on a shadow project, funded through off-the-books accounts. Nothing concrete. But enough to make Clara believe they were getting closer. Still, time was against them. The trial was entering its final stretch. And if they didn't break the case soon, Ava's freedom would come down to 12 strangers and how much doubt they were willing to entertain. 3 days before the final verdict, something unexpected happened. An email. Sent to Rachel's office from a secure source. Encrypted. Untraceable. But within it, a folder, filled with documentation. IP records rerouted through an internal admin account not belonging to Ava. File access logs that placed Julian inside the core data environment the night before the breach. A signed security override from a senior executive who no longer worked at Velvra, timestamped at 2:41 a.m., 2 hours after Ava had logged out. Rachel sat stunned as she read through it. It was everything they needed, and more. But there was a problem. Introducing the documents into evidence this late would require a delay. A motion. Possibly a new hearing. And the judge had already warned both sides. No more surprises. Rachel could be held in contempt for presenting unvetted material from an anonymous source. She showed the files to Ava anyway. Ava didn't blink. "If it's real," she said, "then it has to be seen, even if it delays everything." Rachel took the risk. The next morning, the courtroom was quiet. The judge, visibly frustrated, reviewed the motion. The prosecution protested. The jury was excused while the matter was debated. And for nearly 2 hours, Ava waited in a side room, unsure if her life was about to be saved or further delayed. When they reconvened, the judge made a ruling. The documents would be submitted. Conditionally. They'd be reviewed by an independent analyst over the weekend. If authenticated, they would be admissible. If not, the trial would proceed as scheduled. It bought Ava time. But time wasn't a promise. That night, Micah stayed awake on his couch, refreshing news feeds, reading through legal blogs, looking for anything that could indicate where this might go. Clara reached out to the podcast host again, urging them to do a follow-up episode, not for publicity, but to keep pressure alive. The story had gained traction online. Ava wasn't just a defendant now. She was a conversation. Why are so many young professionals vulnerable to setups like this? What role does silence play in corporate betrayal? Can truth survive inside systems that rely on speed over justice? Meanwhile, Ava sat in her cell, staring at the journal that had become her lifeline. Not knowing if the people outside were close to freeing her or if she'd be convicted before the truth ever surfaced. She thought about her mother that night. About how she used to say, "Life doesn't always give you closure. Sometimes you have to make peace with fragments." But Ava didn't want peace. She wanted answers, and somewhere out there, someone still believed she didn't deserve them, because if she was innocent, someone else had everything to lose. On Monday morning, the courtroom buzzed with unspoken tension. The independent analyst's report was in. The documents submitted by Rachel had been authenticated. The judge, after a brief recess, ruled them admissible. It was a quiet moment, almost anticlimactic, but for Ava, it was a crack in the wall that had surrounded her for months. The truth wasn't just a belief anymore. It was beginning to take form. Julian wasn't present in the courtroom. He hadn't attended the last few hearings, citing professional obligations abroad. But his name now danced through whispered conversations and speculative glances. What once seemed impossible, that a respected executive could manipulate systems so cleanly, now felt eerily plausible. Rachel pressed forward. The newly admitted logs revealed not just Julian's presence at odd hours, but his use of a personal USB device to access internal systems. He had overridden the encryption protocol just once, on the same night the money disappeared. It was too deliberate to be coincidental. The prosecution struggled to contain the narrative. They pivoted. Even if Julian accessed those files, they argued, it doesn't prove Ava didn't. It doesn't erase the fact that her credentials were used. It doesn't eliminate the evidence already presented. But the jury now looked less certain. They listened harder. They scribbled notes. Ava noticed one juror, a young woman no older than herself, blink back tears as Rachel described the sleepless nights Ava had spent in holding, replaying every moment, every mistake, every choice that might have led to this. Outside the courtroom, something else was stirring. Micah had traced one of Julian's associates to a tech startup in Miami. The man, quiet, clean record, new name, had once worked under Julian's direct supervision. Clara managed to secure a short recorded phone call. Nothing direct. No confessions. But in it, the man said just enough. That the money was moved to teach someone not to overreach. That Ava wasn't supposed to fight back. It wasn't admissible. But it was fuel. Ava listened to the clip in her cell that night. She closed her eyes and finally allowed herself a small breath of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim her life. But she also understood what came next. If they were right, if Julian orchestrated this, he wouldn't go down quietly. And the people helping Ava had now crossed into dangerous territory. What began as a fight for her name had become a battle against power, influence, and secrecy. And the closer they got to the truth, the more the shadows moved around them. 2 nights before the final trial session, Rachel received a warning. An anonymous message, just a sentence long: back off. You don't know what you're dealing with. It was delivered through a burner email, no trace, no attachment. Just a chill. She didn't show it to Ava. Not yet. She didn't want to take away the calm that had finally returned to her eyes. Instead, she forwarded the message to Micah, who was already on edge. We need to be careful, he said. If Julian has people watching this close, we don't know what they're capable of. But Clara didn't slow down. She reached out to the journalist who'd been covering Ava's story since the beginning. She leaked just enough, about the USB logs, the override timestamp, the phone call. Not the whole story. Just enough to light a fire. By morning, the media storm had returned. Headlines shifted again. Executive under scrutiny in Ava Chin trial. New evidence may exonerate former Velvet analyst, who framed Ava. Ava saw the news from a small TV in her holding cell. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. But something in her posture changed, like a person preparing to breathe again after months underwater. Then came the final day. The courtroom was packed. Rachel stood, composed but tired. She presented the timeline, piece by piece, connecting digital breadcrumbs to human behavior. She spoke of ambition, manipulation, and how easy it is to vilify the quiet, the unseen, the ones who don't fight back loudly enough. She reminded the jury that truth isn't always loud, sometimes it comes in whispers. Then Ava stood for the last time. She didn't beg. She simply said, I've spent the last 9 months wondering why this happened to me. I still don't know. But I do know who I am. And I know I didn't take what wasn't mine. I've worked hard my whole life to earn the little I have. I wouldn't trade it for anything, not even $50 million. The courtroom held its breath, and then it was over. The jury was excused. Deliberation began. Hours passed. Micah, Clara, Rachel. None of them left the building. Ava sat quietly, waiting, not for a miracle, but for something resembling justice. When the bailiff entered with the envelope, everyone stood, but just as the judge reached for it, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. Shouting, rushing feet, Ava turned toward the doors, and what happened next would change everything. The crash outside the courtroom wasn't just a sound, it was a shockwave. Doors burst open. A stream of shouting and scrambling guards rushed in, trying to contain what sounded like a full-on commotion. Ava's instincts kicked in first. She moved backward from the bench, unsure if she was in danger or if something else had happened. The judge immediately ordered a recess. The jury was ushered out. Security surged around Ava and the attorneys. No one was allowed to leave the courtroom, but something was very wrong. Moments later, a young man, blood on his forehead, handcuffed and struggling, was dragged into the hallway. Micah saw him first. "That's him," he whispered, stunned. "That's the guy Clara tracked in Miami." Julian's old coder. He had shown up. Unannounced. Voluntarily. When questioned by law enforcement, he said he couldn't take it anymore. That he had watched the trial unfold online. That he'd been paid to disappear. But watching Ava being blamed, watching the internet turn her into a symbol, it broke him. He confessed to everything, not on the record. Not in court. But loud enough. Recorded by several bystanders in the hallway before security intervened. The confession spread like wildfire before anyone could contain it. "I built the back-end tool Julian used," he said. "He told me it was for internal analysis. But when the money disappeared and she got blamed, I knew exactly what happened. I helped him do it. Not knowing what it was. I tried to disappear. But she doesn't deserve this." The video was online within 20 minutes. The courtroom couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The judge, though stern and procedural, knew the impact. He issued a delay in the verdict. The jury was sequestered again. The defense moved quickly to have the confession admitted. It would take another day to authenticate, review, verify. Ava was escorted out quietly that afternoon. No handcuffs. Just eyes watching her, now not with judgment, but with something closer to regret. Rachel turned to her and whispered, "They'll never say it, but they know now. They know you didn't do this." But Ava didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because she also knew what this meant. If Julian had been capable of framing her so cleanly, and the man who helped him was suddenly ready to confess, then there were still layers to be uncovered. Motives deeper than anyone imagined. Later that evening, Ava was moved to a private holding room. Media vans circled the courthouse. Her name now trended globally. Not as a criminal, but as a symbol of how easily power can rewrite truth. She sat on the small cot, staring at the ceiling. Her life had been reduced to headlines, edits, threads, and clips. But what she wanted more than anything wasn't just exoneration. It was her life back. She wanted to laugh without wondering who was watching. To walk without feeling like she owed an explanation. To go back to building a life no one had to second-guess. She closed her eyes and waited for the world to catch up. The following morning, the courtroom was packed to the edges. Reporters couldn't get in. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the public from flooding the courthouse steps. What had started as a corporate crime trial was now a national conversation about trust, ambition, and injustice. The judge returned with a statement. He addressed the courtroom calmly, but with something heavier in his voice. In light of the confession submitted through multiple sources, and with a credible corroboration underway, this court will delay the delivery of a verdict. The matter will be referred to the State Prosecution Service for a full criminal investigation into Mr. Julian Marks, and the charges against Ms. Ava Chin will be formally suspended pending closure of said investigation. Suspended. Not dismissed. Not cleared. But suspended. Still, the courtroom erupted. Rachel closed her eyes and exhaled. Clara gripped Micah's arm. Ava sat still for a moment before nodding once. It wasn't over. But it was finally moving in the right direction. After the session, Ava walked out of the courtroom for the first time in months, not through a holding tunnel, but through the front exit. Reporters shouted her name. Microphones reached. Cameras flashed. But she didn't stop. Micah was waiting in the car. As she got in, Clara turned from the front seat. You did it, she said softly. No, Ava replied. We all did. The ride was quiet. No one knew what to say. The air felt heavy, not with fear, but with questions. What would happen to Julian? Would the confession hold up in a federal case? Would Ava ever be compensated for what she lost? But Ava wasn't thinking about that. She stared out the window at a city that felt different now. She saw it with new eyes, clearer, sharper. The same streets that once felt like home had watched her world fall apart. But they'd also seen her survive. Later that night, Ava received a message from someone she hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Her ex. The boy who had disappeared when the charges began, too scared to stand beside her, too unsure to fight the wind of public opinion. It was a short message. I saw the news. I never believed it. I just didn't know how to be strong for you. I'm sorry. She didn't reply, not because she was angry, but because she had learned something deeper. Love built on silence isn't love. And strength isn't found in who stands beside you when it's easy. It's found in those who show up when it's hardest, even if their voice shakes. Ava turned off her phone. And for the first time in nearly a year, she slept, not as a prisoner, not as a suspect, but as someone who still had a long road ahead, and a reason to walk it. The next morning, a federal investigation into Julian Marks was officially launched. Authorities visited Velvera's headquarters. Offices were searched, records seized. A statement from the company's board was released within hours, cold, calculated, distancing themselves from a man who had once been the golden boy of their expansion plans. Julian, however, was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared 2 days earlier, supposedly on a business trip overseas. His phone disconnected, his emails auto-replying. His apartment stood empty. No family contact. No known destination. His sudden absence only intensified the conversation. News anchors debated guilt and power. Social media dissected his past, his rise, his silence. Ava's face appeared in every headline again, but this time, not as a criminal, not even as a victim, but as a question. A reflection of everything people were too afraid to confront about how easily trust can be misused, and how loud innocence has to scream to be heard. Meanwhile, Ava returned to her mother's small home on the edge of the city. The media had offered her money for interviews, podcast deals, documentaries. But she declined them all. She just wanted quiet. She walked into her old room, still intact, still untouched, and stood there without moving for several minutes. Then she sat on the floor and allowed herself to cry. Not the silent, suppressed tears she'd mastered in her cell, but the loud, aching kind that belonged to someone who had carried too much for too long. Micah and Clara visited that evening. They didn't bring anything, no files, no updates. Just food, laughter, life. And as they sat on the porch, the three of them watching the neighborhood settle into dusk, Ava said something that stopped them both. I don't think I'll ever go back to being the person I was before this. Micah looked at her and nodded. That's okay. Maybe the person you were wasn't meant to carry this. But the person you've become, she can build something different. It wasn't closure, but it was something close. 2 weeks later, the federal case against Julian Marks was confirmed. More employees came forward. More documents surfaced. A secondary database revealed offshore accounts tied directly to Julian and his private shell firms. Everything Ava had been accused of doing, every transaction, every code injection, every security breach, was traced back, one by one, to him. And finally, the state issued a formal apology to Ava Chin. Not just a dismissal. A public apology. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't restore the months she'd lost or the friends who never called. But it acknowledged the lie. And in a world where justice rarely speaks loudly, that acknowledgement mattered. Ava didn't attend the press conference. She watched it from her living room, curled up in a hoodie, tea in hand. Her mom beside her. Quiet. Steady. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, Ava started speaking again, not on stages, not to cameras, but at schools, small auditoriums, youth centers. She talked about digital ethics. About power. About fear and silence. She talked about what it means to be doubted, to fight without proof, to feel your name become a stranger to you. And slowly, people listened. At one talk, a girl asked her, "How did you not give up when everyone believed you were guilty?" Ava paused, then said, "I almost did. Every day. But there was always one person, sometimes two, who didn't walk away. And sometimes that's enough to keep standing." Rachel kept her job but took fewer cases. Clara moved to New York to produce investigative pieces. Micah returned to his design work, occasionally still texting Ava headlines that reminded him of her, stories where someone found the truth, no matter how long it took, and Ava she didn't just rebuild, she reimagined. Not for revenge. Not for validation. But because she had learned the quiet power of persistence, the delicate strength of holding on when the world lets go. Ava Chin was once accused of stealing $50 million. Now, she stood for something worth far more. And even though some people would still remember her name for the wrong reason, she had finally found a reason to remember it for the right one. Her story wasn't just about proving innocence. It was about reclaiming identity, and the quiet, beautiful courage it takes to be seen again.